welcome to episode
18.
which is
It was not my idea, but uncomfortable conversations with an Asian woman.
that's me.
Oh, clearly.
There you go.
Inspired by Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man by Emmanuel Acho.
I think so.
Acho?
Something.
Football player?
Used to be.
Right. And then he did this.
Well, that's...
Well, no, I mean, like not only that, but he stopped playing football.
Yes.
Before that.
And then he became, what's her name? Molly's fiance.
Who's Molly?
From Insecure.
Really?
He was her beautiful black men arm candy for a while, and I think he got off that train where she seems to be like, we had a great relationship, everything was good, and he just nothing. Sounds like maybe he got tired of her. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know what Molly does in her life.
Me neither.
So this episode is going to be inspired by that, but not exactly that, because I don't remember what his format is.
I don't think he had a format really. It's just the uncomfortableness and addressing it.
And the conversation.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Anyhoodle. I really like that series, so it was a good idea on your part.
And I will try to be your Matthew McConaughey.
Please.
All right.
No.
I was a young man in Texas. So I had black
young
friends,
man in
I had
Texas.
white friends, I had Indian friends. You know.
Okay, so why did you suggest this? I'm curious.
I feel as if this is my personal opinion. The overall tenor of the previous 17 episodes have been dominated by my topics and curiosities and rants and tangents and so on and so on and so on and so on. So I think this is a good moment in time for you to take a clear and affirmative lead for the direction of this episode and be the dictator of the topics.
Has nothing to do with the heightened.
Yeah, that's what I mean. The times, I think it's just like when in the NHL during the playoffs when there was only like 2 black players left, and they all decided whatever his message is, let's stand behind that and see where we could follow. So I think the head lead. I am here.
Well, that being said, I guess the first thing we can talk about is how we feel about all the anti-Asian, racially charged hate crimes and attacks on Asian businesses, mostly Asian elderly and Asian people in general. How do you feel about what's going on?
I'll say
As a non-Asian person.
yes. As the B in the BIPOC. Hey, it's true. It's the B in the BIPOC.
And the C.
There you go. The BC. Here we go, bud. Bud. Bars. You know what I'm saying? But as I was saying, one, I've been hearing about it passively, and also passively through you, and at the same time, where like I've seen posts of Daniel Day Kim like putting ransoms out, and it's almost seemed, to be honest, theatrical because it hasn't been connected to real day events for me. And I don't know if that speaks to the culture of Asians in terms of addressing things that are affecting Asians as a whole, or the way Asians engage with addressing issues. I don't know what it is, but the news wasn't connecting. It was just hearing like Jeremy Lin saying, somebody called me coronavirus on the basketball court. Not saying that it's acceptable, but when you hear that, it doesn't really trigger an alarm bell as this is a pandemic of issues. It sounds like somebody was being a dick. Like you're not getting the message of the violence. And what drove it home for me, which is really late, and once again, I still haven't even seen the stat. I take all this off the strength of you as being an Asian. The stat of hate crimes in Vancouver being up over 700%. that's something that I could put context to because I could see how Vancouver's racial composition is. So I could see it's us against them. And in the good times, people are in their boroughs and happy, and they give the semblance of a cohesive city. But in the bad times, you can see where the fracture lines are, and it's like the Fraser River. It literally is. So you could see where things could change. It's kind of like akin to how when the Jews were in Germany, when the Germans weren't happy, it wasn't hard to get the populace to be okay with treating them a certain way because it was easy to gather common feeling and sentiment of discomfort or uncomfortable thoughts or just being whatever you don't know you fear in many cases. And when you have a large group enough, a large enough group, you can be very hateful, aka racist, with that. So I'm not surprised, but the numbers for somebody like me drive home the actual message to empathize with, because without the numbers, everybody's screaming about an issue. Everybody is screaming about an issue, and you have to play devil's advocate and kind of prejudge on a scale from when you just see it in bits and pieces in media here. You're like, I really don't know what's going on. All I see is I'm putting a ransom out on people who are hurting Asians, but I'm not seeing the Asian news of the people being hurt. But now I think the temperature is rising. I don't know if that's due to Asians speaking up more or if it's just more of it happening, more of it being filmed. I don't know, but it's finally gotten to the masses. Now, I don't know how long it's been bubbling. You could answer that, I would think.
I think it depends on what you engage with. Like, I think lots of things that you engage with on your social media, for example, or the people that you have in your community, like let's say as your Facebook group friends, because let's face it, most of the news that we get is all off social media these days. So very rarely are people turning on the news, or very rarely are people like actually going to news sites to read the news. They've usually been directed there by a social media post. And very rarely do people actually click into the full story of all those things. They basically just see a post or a clip and they read a caption. And oftentimes everything on social media, in my opinion, gets taken out of context or else doesn't paint the full context of every picture. So I can understand how you wouldn't feel connected because I don't feel like you engage with the same things that I do. Mm-hmm. Just like I don't engage with the same things that you do in the Black community. So I think, but I do think that because so much of culture and pop culture in general is influenced by the Black community, I can feel closer to Black issues, not just because of you, but because I engage with Black culture more than you engage with Asian culture, I think.
Yeah.
Like, it's not like the music that we listen to is Asian artists. It's Black artists.
Yep.
It's not like the movies we watch are predominantly Asian. They're mostly Black movies.
Yeah.
Well, all movies, but in general, Asian media is still less than. It's not popular. Asians are still not popular in pop culture. So I can understand how people who are not Asian don't feel connected to what's happening in the Asian community because the things that we do are not necessarily ingrained in pop culture. There are aspects of culture that all communities take part in that are rooted in Asia, like anime, like all the food like Asian food, but it's really hard to pinpoint what in pop culture comes from Asian people.
I do think something that you just said is kind of the reason why this is happening, and it's kind of akin to the missing Indigenous woman. If people don't care about you, it's easy to dehumanize you.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, like, even though like our convenience stores are majority Asian or Southeast Asian owned, and to us they're just
South
there.
Asian.
Yeah, they're just there, and they're not humans. They're services. Mm-hmm. They don't speak the language. They don't interact with you. There's a lot of cultural misunderstanding in many cases. So everybody can see Asians as a whole. If you're not in an area where Asian, like I feel like in Vancouver, you have to, certain generations are getting the ability to grow up with Asians. So they're humanized as a default. Whereas if you go to communities in the States, from what I've seen, it's almost like you have to turn off not turn off the lights. Like it's like a secret community. It's not as mixed in. Like if you go to Los Angeles, it's a different story. But I mean, if you go into small towns, wherever, the Asian community, if it's small, it stays within itself and it doesn't share with the rest, or
If
it
you
doesn't
go
get
into small
mixed.
towns in North America, you will either get all white or you will get black white.
Yeah,
You don't really get the immigrants. Immigrants stay with each other because we're immigrants. And the reason for that is because of the discrimination against immigrants.
yeah.
So, like, it makes sense why people don't really care.
You guys feel like other to a
that's
lot of
the
people.
sentiment is that most people don't really care, and most people have no idea what Asia actually is. Like, Asia is such a big continent, and people will generalize. This is the thing that comes up a lot, is that I hate generalizations on any culture or on any race or on anything, is because most people will associate Asian with Chinese.
Hmm.
And most people will associate Asian features with China and Chinese people. And I understand that people will say you all look the same, but on the other side of it, you could argue that with every single race. All white people to me look the same. You could argue that all black people look the same. All Latin people look the same. It's just whether or not you're willing to look for the differences, or whether or not you're willing to appreciate that there are differences that exist.
It's actually a scientific reason. It's because whatever you've been grown around, you learn this specific cues of that phenotype and learn to discern. You have more of a database to judge with. So you're actually, it's complete logic why other people of other races don't understand the subtleties of other racial features.
Well, yes, but that's just going back to what I'm saying about whether or not you personally are going to actively try and see the differences. That's completely up to you. If you don't, then you'll default to this scientific reason. So, especially growing up, because I'm not just one Asian, I'm three different types of Asian. And so, one, people get very confused. They're like, well, you don't look Chinese. So Chinese people who are like purebloods are like, no, you're not Chinese. As we saw when this Filipino lady came to clean our house the other day, I'm not purebred Filipino. And so she was like, oh, you're not a real Pinay because you don't speak the language. And I was like, okay. I mean, technically she's not wrong because I'm not full, but I wouldn't say I'm not real. I do have Filipino blood and Chinese blood. And on the same side of things, I'm Thai, but most people don't know what Thai people look like. And so they see me and they're just like, Chinese. You've got to be Chinese. And then being the way that I talk, I was born in Canada, so I don't speak any of those languages. I have knowledge of the languages because of my parents and because of the other Asians I interact with who are also first generation Asians, but I'm a very confusing type of Asian for a lot of people, I feel.
As I said, which I guess you only found out recently, when I first met you, on the first day that you came over, you reminded me of a grimy Canadian. And it was comforting meeting a Canadian in Vancouver, as weird as that sounds. It's hard to give context to that without coming from central Canada and then going west. And you're not sure what you're interacting with or who you're interacting with because it's still so new. There are so many gray spots of characters that you're used to seeing, so it's hard to draw the line. It's like connect the dot of what you expect of people.
That being said, I still interact with all of the typical Asian discriminatory remarks and prejudice and ignorance from people who are not Asian and from people who are Asian, as I've come to notice. So it's interesting because there's lots of people like me, but there are also people who are first generation but are just one type of Asian, so it's a little bit easier for them to identify with a particular community. Like all my friends, most of my friends are Filipino, and I grew up with a lot of Filipino kids, and like pure. So pure in a sense that even though you might have Chinese blood, which lots of Filipinos will tell you, or even if you have some Latin blood, which lots of Filipinos will tell you, your parents speak predominantly Filipino. They were born in the Philippines, so you're Filipino, and that's visibly also what you can be. But I'm not that. So when I used to go over to my Filipino friends' houses, not all of them, but some of them, it's like, oh, what are you? Like, I get that vibe from other Filipino parents who are like, well, you're not really Filipino, and you don't speak Filipino, you don't understand it either, so you're just a Canadian kid. And I'm like, okay, thanks for telling me what I am.
Vous êtes seulement Canadien. Mind you, I would say that's how I see you also.
Canadian? I introduce myself to you as Canadian.
Yes.
Like, I put my nationality before my ethnic background because
Yes.
I was born here. So I don't have the same, like, I can't say that I really identify with being any one of the Asians that I am because I didn't grow up in those countries. So
I wonder if I grew up feeling more Caribbean than you grew up feeling Asian.
probably.
Because at the flip side, all of my friends, even people who weren't Caribbean, would get cheesed at me because they always felt like I identified more as a Canadian than as a Caribbean, which most of my friends did growing up. It's interesting. But you still probably feel as if I still identified more as a Caribbean than you did as an Asian.
Not in my first impression. In my first impression, you were just Canadian.
Okay.
Because I didn't really know I didn't know how deep your Caribbean, like, if all your friends were Caribbean. I didn't know all that stuff on first meeting you. Like you said, when you first met me, you thought I was a grimy Canadian. I also thought you were Canadian. Just Canadian.
Sweet.
So seeing as we both saw each other as Canadians,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is great. I think that that's something interesting that doesn't happen a lot, especially like for me growing up in Vancouver, where it's like white and then immigrant. And in terms of immigrants, it's like South Asian, Asian, Southeast Asian, every type of Asian, but immigrant. Predominantly Chinese, I will say. It was refreshing to feel like a Canadian. For you to identify me as a Canadian first before those other things. Because growing up there, every single white person, I cannot stress enough, would say to me how great my English is. That's like the number one thing that it's like ingrained in my mind to defend my English. Because how many people would say, wow, your English is so good. Or where are you really from? You are not from here. Where are you really from? And the thing is, there's an innocence and an ignorance in that question and a naivety, because I can understand why someone would ask that. They're probably trying to figure out like what kind of Asian you are and ask you that, which is a perfectly normal question to ask, I think. I think that's still a respectable question to ask. I ask other Asians what kind of Asian they are. I ask you, what kind of black are they? Like, what kind of Caribbean are they? Because I want to know the specific country. And I don't think that that's a bad thing to want to ask. But in the way that you ask determines the answer you'll get. Because I think that a lot of first generation Asians are asked that question so often that it becomes quite offensive after a while.
It's a trigger.
To constantly have to say, I'm born here. Or instead of that innocence, curiosity, ignorance, but generally a good intention behind that question, there's the opposite side, which is go back to your country. Go back to China specifically.
China.
Where I'm like,
China.
I'm neither of those things. So if you want me to go back to my country, I will just walk 2 blocks to my house and I will be there in a jiff. And if you want me to go back to China, I'll just tell you I've never even fucking been there. So my favorite part is when white people do their backpacking. You know, they do their go find yourself, eat, pray, love.
I went to Thailand.
Yeah, 100%. Oh my gosh, I've been to Thailand. Cool. Oh my gosh, like Sawadee-ka. I'm like, cool. That's probably better than what I can say. Or like, oh, have you ever been to China? Oh my gosh, I was in China. I taught English there for a year. It's like, cool.
I've never been to the Asian continent.
You will. You have an open invitation from my father who lives in Thailand.
I would like to one day. I would like to.
But like only recently have I gone back to Thailand. I went to Thailand and the Philippines when I was a kid because the Chinese side of me is a very small portion, but As a kid, I was there in my home countries, and didn't get to go back until it's expensive to go there. So it's been a while, but I feel like right now with all of the anti-Asian attacks going on, like you mentioned this in an early podcast that we had, where you had your moment of just like being overwhelmed and being fed up of what's happening in the Black community. That's not new. I think that's the thing that's been difficult, I guess, and I'm going out of order here, but who cares? We were talking about this the other day, which is like there's so much anti-ness within our communities. And right now, in the last year and a half, it's been all focused on these two communities, primarily, of like the China virus is here and the Black Lives Matter is over here. And it sucks because there's a lot of support and there's a lot of unity and a lot of solidarity, but there's also a ton of anti-ness. There's so much anti-Blackness in the Asian community. And
vice versa.
And people think that it's just our elderly, like seniors, Asian seniors, but it's not. There's also young purebreds. I don't know I can't make a generalization because I don't want to on first generation Asian Americans, but I do notice, because I'm also in a lot of like just Asian groups on social media and stuff, immigrants who were born in a different country and come here who are purely Asian carry the same anti-Blackness that their parents and their generations of families have in their mindsets. So it's not just the seniors, it's also your peers. Like you think that you're identifying with the Asian person next to you, and then this pandemic comes and you realize, we are not the same. And I think although you're not the same, it's important to remember to like just decide, either you want to spend your time educating that person or you don't. And for me, I'll spend the time because I don't think I'm anti-Black. You can let me know.
I do not think so. I wouldn't characterize you as such.
I try to be as supportive as I can be, but
absolutely. Like I've told you a million times, a lot of Black people, if they heard me speak, would want to disown me. And I completely understand why. And I'm sure there are a lot of things that I would say that would offend everybody, but I think it underscores that it's even distribution. It's more so a reflection of my method of thinking, not a disdain for any one culture, because I will have criticisms of all, including myself, as I led with. But during this groundswell of Asian support that has gotten to the level of patronizing points that I've seen for Black Lives Matter, or that I've lived through, I guess, forever. Of hey, it's February, let's support Black people. I wonder how patronizing it is. One, but two, I almost could predict the resistance and pushback from certain Black circles of the narrative of solidarity, and I could see it coming. And I was wondering how it was going to manifest and how it was going to play out and how close it was going to get to me. We all live in a real world where people in our own circle will end up surprising us with their behavior. And I was wondering, where is this going to go? And I'm very glad that I did not ever have to have a conversation with anybody near me where I had to check them in some way or say, well, I don't agree with that, even though I understand. I didn't even have to have any of those conversations, which is a good thing. I'm
also lucky I didn't have to do that.
Very,
my
very
friend
good
circle, because I would say that your close friend circle is very Black.
Yeah.
My friend circle is very Asian.
Yeah.
And that's okay. I'm like, why are all your friends the same? I don't give a shit. Those are your friends who you grew up with, and they're good people.
Yeah.
And I'm really lucky I didn't have to. I didn't have to have every person were writing harder for Black Lives Matter than it appeared that I would be. Like, all my friends were super supportive. All my friends checked in, like asked me to ask you, like, hey, just, let Yannick know,
See, and here's the thing. I feel like every other community is very much in tune to the Black struggle, but nobody knows about what happens in the Asian community. So there's no way to really get a sincere, how are you? Because from the outside, playing devil's advocate, the complaints can seem trivial until you get to the point where you see an equivalent where, oh, they did them like they did us. Now, like
I think that's a fair.
yeah.
I think that's fair to say for the Black community.
Yeah, exactly.
But I feel like, again, I don't like to make generalizations, and I don't like to speak on behalf of me and all other Asians. Everything I say here is my own unique experience because I don't feel like most people think like me in general, in the same way that you're very much the same. You have your own thought process. So I can definitely understand how it may seem trivial because everything seems trivial if it's not connected to you.
Yeah.
Everything seems like performative and theatrical if you're not connected to it. This is how white people feel about probably all BIPOC relations.
Yeah.
They're probably like, well,
I don't know about that. I didn't see it. I'm poor too.
they just don't get it. And it's I would expect that being a person of color would give you one notch up in terms of, okay, there's some commonality. White people are always oppressing us. We are all victims of white supremacy. Even if we're divided and in between, we're still just a notch down from white supremacy. Like that's our commonality. So for me, I would hope that one thing would be enough, which it's not. And that's also a very idealistic and naive thing to think. But I was saying, like we were talking about this the other day, which is, why does this work? Mm-hmm. Why are we able to communicate and learn about each other? Because I had ignorances before I met you about Black people. I'm sure you had ignorances about Asian people before you met me. But we have commonality. We were both born in Canada. We're both Canadian. Mm-hmm. We identify as Canadian first, I feel. Range. We're in the same age range, the same generation. We grew up with Canadian media.
Yeah.
I may have, not partaken in the raccoon thing that you bought me as
raccoon.
Deep, but we can have commonality on Much Music,
yes,
and Music Plus,
yes,
and Electric Circus, and Red Shoe Diaries, like I don't know, Showcase. That was on Showcase 39, okay. Channel 39, Channel
All
2.
I know is Bleu Nuit, Quebec.
Well, the Quebec stuff I can't as much, but we have those commonalities. But why are we able to be here? Why are we able to support each other?
Something which was the genesis purpose of this podcast, was to highlight that when we discuss things, we go to a layer, one that can only be gotten to through a certain state of respect and interaction with the other party while they're trying to get their point across and also understand yours, and going as far down and deep as possible on the topic without ever losing sight on the fact that the purpose of this is for understanding and knowledge, not for demeaning or passive aggressiveness or any type of judgment. It's for straight inquisition.
It's for education.
Yeah. And from that perspective, it makes it very hard to fight about something, because you know that the purpose is to get somewhere, not to antagonize.
I think
because a lot of the things can sound antagonistic, especially coming from me, I'm sure.
Yeah. And patronizing.
Yes.
And judgmental.
Very
and rude.
Sure. Absolutely.
But
direct.
I think the important part to remember about our conversations around race and around ignorance is that we're both willing to admit that we are ignorant, and that the whole point of talking is to be less ignorant. Yeah. The whole point of having a conversation is to learn about another person, not to devalue their experience, because I can't tell him he's wrong I can't tell him he's wrong. Because his experience is learned. His experience is his own. I can respect that his experience and his thoughts are valid. And perhaps if I share something that is in contrast to that, it's his decision whether or not he wants to accept that and either change his position, learn something,
amend,
observe it as something new, update your hardware and software.
Yeah.
That's all you really need to do.
That's all I'm ever trying to do, actually. But I think that my delivery does not always get that point across.
No, I think you're just lucky that I have time.
I was meaning to the outside world.
I know, but I'm the inside world, and you do not interact with the outside world as much as you interact with me.
Indeed. But in general, I tend to, because I'm so curious about the stuff that never gets spoken about, it tends to be the most sensitive things, and it tends to get people very aggressive and defensive towards me, and my lack of return of that aggression only confounds their aggression because it's very confusing, I guess.
At times, I definitely feel like the way that you speak when you ask questions does sound patronizing, does sound like very rude
Yeah.
and ignorant. But I don't really get upset at it because you wouldn't ask if you weren't trying to not be ignorant or if you weren't trying to actually find truth
Yeah.
in it or verify how you feel. You wouldn't ask to begin with. So just because you're not asking in a way that's pleasant for my ears doesn't mean that the result isn't the same.
Yeah.
We're both speaking and asking for the same result, which is just to learn more.
Yeah.
Like there's lots of times where you've asked me, so how do you feel about, when Trump called it the China virus? Because I think it's like this. I'm like, well, let's talk about that for a minute here,
Indeed. Full disclosure. And I as a black man, I've had to have this discussion with black women within my own cultural circle where we have to, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because Trump is a dick, sexist, asshole, all these types of things, it doesn't mean he isn't a funny sounding man. It's just his context isn't very good. But China can sound funny. I'm just saying it might not be the right thing to do. But I can take it out of context like that sounds funny.
He asked me, how do you feel about Trump calling it the China virus? Are you offended by that? Because technically it's from China.
Yeah.
That's what he said.
Yeah.
And so upon hearing that, I'm sure most people would be like, the fuck?
Yeah. But it's a fair question.
It is. Well, here's the thing. Most questions are fair.
Yeah.
If you're asking them, unless you're asking them sarcastically, then don't ask them at all. But if you are sincerely asking a question, then every question is fair game.
Like, I want to ascertain what I should expect in the best case of communications with an Asian about that topic, because I trust her to just give the answer and not take it as an attack. So it's like my way of seeing, okay, before I go speak to the wrong person and then they take it as he's a racist, he's an asshole, he's insensitive, I want to know.
I'm your Asian filter.
Yeah.
Let me run it by the committee.
Yeah, it's more so.
But same.
Yeah.
I do that with you.
I do that with full disclosure. A guy who used to work for Rebel Media. That's not something most people want to promote, but I like the fact that I can talk to somebody from somewhere completely different than I would ever go to mentally, with the understanding that even though we're different, I know the one thing that will make this discussion always good is that between he and I, we respect each other. Mm-hmm. As long as you respect the individual, there's so much room for learning and discussion. There's so much room where you might even realize, you know what, we're not that different.
We're not that different, but also, even if we are,
what's
wrong with that? That's the whole point. If we're talking about diversity, but then you want everyone to assimilate to your opinions and thoughts, you want everyone to agree with you, then how are we having diverse perspectives? How are we supposed to have diversity if everybody wants everybody to think exactly as they do and are upset when it's different?
Yeah, you got to be able to hear a different opinion without losing your shit. Yeah.
As we were saying, it's good to have different perspectives. Like, we can't disagree more. I disagree with him on a lot of stuff. We disagree on a lot of stuff.
Oh yeah.
But we also agree on a lot of stuff. And the only way we've been able to find those things out is to have conversations.
Yep.
This is why we started the whole podcast, is because we have conversations all the time about everything. And
I ask some random shit.
Everything. And and the thing is, I find that that's what irks me the most about what's going on in the times right now, is that there's not enough of conversation. There's not enough of respectful conversation where the end result is that both parties just learn something. You don't have to go into every conversation expecting to win.
Yeah.
Like, I think society has trained us to win. You want to have the last word. You want to be the person to change that person's mind. Why? Whose responsibility is that? Nobody's responsibility is to change anybody other than themselves.
Insecure thinkers wish to change the minds of others.
Yeah.
You can have two coexisting frames of thought without having to be in opposition of one another. It's kind of like a puzzle piece. They can interweave. They can interweave, and you can be really connected, if anything, better because of it, because those interweaving points will be each of your strengths, and they can become eventually like a seamless bond. But a lot of people treat those as like razor's edges. Like, nah, I'm coming in with my teeth up and my claws out. Like, But whenever it's all, I think what we had came to this conclusion. It's hopeless. It's all hopeless because
That's the sad part. It is because unless, and I don't think it's going to happen now, but unless we change social norms to actually understand what conversation means, not argument.
yeah,
Conversation, debate, and argument are three different things.
yeah.
Three different things, and they all have
Everybody's
different outcomes. But everybody always resorts to argument.
Mhm.
Why is that? If you were really comfortable with your stance and you were okay with that person not accepting how you think and how you feel and absorbing your opinion, but just at the very least understanding you, you would not even feel the need to argue.
Yep.
Why do you have to argue about something that is literally useless to argue about?
Yep.
Everybody is entitled to their own opinions and everybody's experiences are valid. Just like people who, like, I see in comments on anti-Asian, like, awareness posts, black people saying, fuck that. I'm not standing up for them. I'm not, they weren't there for us, blah, blah, blah. And on the other side, you see Asians saying, fuck Black Lives Matter. We don't want you're the ones who have been beating us, and vice versa. Like, there's so much of that everywhere. And it's disheartening because, as I said, this works.
Mm-hmm.
So if those people just took a minute to understand, okay, well, why do you feel that way? What was your experience that led you to feeling like you don't want to support Asians? Let me hear it. As an Asian, let me hear it. And vice versa.
Disclosure. And I think this honesty and this transparency is something that is also needed. It's like what they did in South Africa, where you got to go to each other and say, I did do this.
Yeah.
And I did feel this way. Myself, as a black man who has an Asian fiance, still has that instinctive reactionary, well, I have the experiences of knowing where when I went into the dépanneurs and the Asian owners looked at me like shit, there's still that initial like, but what about, but it takes one, I think, education, personal growth, maturation to also understand how to filter one's initial reactions and understand that they're not always what you must react upon and not what you must build your foundation of thought upon. I know that she is not the Asian store owner that used to treat me like trash. And vice versa. They're two different people. And there are people out there who are Asian who have been nothing but kind to me and just great humans to me. But at the same time, I've had the flip side sincerely happen to me consistently. So I can also empathize if I were to encounter a black person who says, nah, man, they treat me like shit. And I wouldn't even argue with them. But I would say, that's a given. But be careful to not brush everybody with the same brush because
generalize.
you do not appreciate it when it's done to you. That's all that I would say. I wouldn't invalidate his feelings because I know that they are coming from a place of fact. I know that. But at the same time, it's an opportunity to be like, well, now that, like, let's say you see that Asian person who you now see is defending their store and they could use you. You could go over there and say, nah, a lot of my friends tell me that I live in a dream world with my reactionary process to these types of situations, but I see opportunities where, in a way where if you want to be devilish to make it more palatable to yourself and think, well, if I help them in their time of need, they'll owe me. Whatever you have to do to rationalize it to yourself, but if you see somebody who needs you after they slapped your hand away when you needed them, you're like, I'm gonna try again with you, and maybe you'll realize that we need to be together. Like we need to partner. We need to think about each other. Like when I think of Jesus and the Black Messiah, Black Jesus and the whatever it was called.
Jesus and the Black Messiah.
Yeah. When he went to the other rival black gangs, he didn't go there with aggression. He went there humbly and said, "Listen, I'll try again. We should partner. All right, I'll come back. I think it's in our best interest. As long as your cause is just, the timing of when you apply it is never wrong, and it's always the right act, no matter what. So I would say don't allow those situations to pull your character down. Like in the situations where I've been treated poorly by many people of many races, but in the time where I can be like, you know what? For me, it's kind of like a pleasure when I'm like, no, I'm still here in the same exact character. And this black man can help you. And now you don't have a choice but to respect him. And if it burns you inside, that's not my issue. but you have digested the fact, and
Mm-hmm.
that's what's killing you. If you have to readjust your perception, that's fine. But your reality is that you needed that help,
Mm-hmm.
and I like trying to find the moments where you are the beacon of hope, because if anything, it's only more power.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
More power begets more power.
100%. That's what I was seeing on well, see what you were.
When you think of Godfather, when it starts, he immigrates to New York and he realizes people that look like him are being taken advantage of by people who look like him. And he says, you know what, I'm going to take care of my people and they'll take care of me because of it.
Mm-hmm.
He got to a point of power by saying, I need you and you need me.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way things progress most. When I think of treats and treats, the amount of people that I could think of who put a little bit into me, a little bit, they gave me power, but that gives them power because when they could tell the story like, I helped that man build that.
I think there's this notion of if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And that is a very bare minimum in terms of doing what's right and supporting somebody.
Yeah.
However, I also think that that's not the only way you can support somebody. And that if you have to resort to that, fine, whatever, as you were saying, whatever you need to make it work for you, make it work for you. And I completely understand anti-blackness in the Asian community because I even though it's not in my family, like I feel like my family has been welcoming to you.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like even like my mom, she's never made any comments to me, at least, about your color affecting the way that you treat me.
Mm-hmm.
Never. It has never had to do with any color issue there. And even like my grandma, who's even more of a generation beyond her. My grandma was born in 1928. When she first met you, she made you and me her flip phone background.
Yeah.
Like she has never made any mention. My dad spending time with you,
Yeah.
he's never made any mention. And yet, like in me, I had so much fear of it because I wasn't sure because I know it exists. And I'm like, okay, like already thinking preventatively, okay, if it happens, what am I going to do? How am I going to talk to my parents about this? How am I going to talk to my family about this? Whatever.
Mm.
And I'm lucky that I didn't have to do that. And what I also think is interesting is that there are people who have time and they will go hard for this reason to be, I think I was mentioning, like, I was confused as to how does this work? Like, how can we translate this into other people? How can we empower other people to just have conversations, to understand one another and, pull back some of the anti-blackness and some of the anti-Asianness that is within each of our communities. And I think that you gotta have time. You gotta want to do it. You gotta want to have conversations and be open. And one of the best ways to show how open you are is not to devalue or tell people they are wrong for feeling and experiencing what they have. And the thing is, like, there are people who are willing to point out, no, there's solidarity here. And even if you don't love me, I still love you.
That takes strength.
Yeah.
It takes strength.
Especially if you have entire generations telling you that you can't do that.
Yeah.
And I think that's those people's, like, standing back and, as I said to you before, if it was just like a video game and it was like, okay, us against whites, like us against white supremacy, there's strength in numbers. And if we can get over and if we can pull back and educate each other around solidarity, around what solidarity can mean, how we can take advantage of each other and learn from each other, I mean, so we could do it.
I'd like to ask a blatant question, which might not be formatted in the right way.
As per usual, but go on.
But yes, at this moment, solidarity is very clear as an ask from the Asian community because the oppressor is very clear, has very clearly set their sights on Asians at this moment. Very clearly, like, you're the main focus of our hate right now. Mm-hmm. In terms of the media, at least. Mm-hmm. But I ask this, just like when the spotlight wanes off of Black Lives Matter or this or that, what will it take to have sincere desire for solidarity within the Asian community with, one, not just only Asians, two, not passive support and solidarity with blacks while still shaking the white's hand in front? What will it take to have a sincere shift in overall Asian cultural behavior to actually have sincere respect for black struggle?
Okay, well, I can't answer that question for the Asian community. That's a big question. But what I can say that I think will contribute to that is that there are a lot of young Asians, like the young generation, millennials and younger, who are one, actively educating and doing their part in supporting Black lives, not just now, but continuously. Like, it hasn't stopped. I've seen people, they were doing it last March and now it's gone. And now it's just like regular. I still see people who are Asian in my community continuously, like, more woke than other people.
Athena gets the gold star in my book at all times.
Well, she's a gold star for all.
Yeah,
all
exactly.
Things. And she's Asian, so she's a gold star for me.
Yeah.
But I think that what the sincerity where it comes from, the shift, one, I don't think it happens overnight. I don't think anything happens overnight. Racism hasn't stopped in 400 years. Slavery hasn't stopped in 400 years. Anti and divisiveness within communities, within Asian communities, within the Black community hasn't stopped for many, many years. So the shift is going to take generations, if at all. It can totally shift over to the other side. But what I think will increase sincere support is conversation. I see a lot of young Asians who, because they haven't been enslaved for 400 years and because they haven't been oppressed in the same way that white people and colonizers have oppressed the Black communities, there's a sincere feeling amongst especially young Asians that I see, and first generation born, like, Asian Americans, that feel like,
get over it.
No, that feel like right now we're experiencing only an ounce of what Black people have experienced for many, many years. And they're doing their part to continue to keep learning individually to shift that within themselves. I think that when support becomes performative is when you start doing to raise awareness for others, but you don't actually take time to educate yourself. You just keep posting stuff for other people to see. But when you really
self-reach around.
Yeah, exactly. But I really do think that for the younger generation that is continuously writing hard and going out, and this sort of like emergence of an activist generation, it so seems that the continuation of that will perpetuate even more of a shift going forward. And I think that beyond these times right now, there's a lot of empathy being created within Asians, and it's just a matter of being brave enough to say, Black people have been fucked over for many, many years, and they're fucked over every day in the most ingrained ways in a white supremacist society. The same can be said for Indigenous people. We are on stolen land. Everything we have, every way that we move in our mobility is because of the Indigenous peoples, and they have been fucked for I don't even know how far back, as being the first peoples, First Nations of our lands, native to our lands. So they've been fucked, and there are so many oppressed groups that have been fucked that I think there needs to be some bravery in the acknowledgement that in North America, those groups have really been fucked. And that as Asian immigrants, as we only came over at a certain time, there needs to be an acknowledgement from the Asian community, Asian American community, that we're not as fucked as they have been. That's not to say that we haven't been fucked. Mm-hmm. And I think there needs to be acknowledgement on Indigenous and Black communities to say, yeah, they got fucked too.
Absolutely. I think that's the biggest issue that I think happens in the general Black discussion when it comes to help Asians. It's that sometimes it feels like, yeah, it's been happening to us forever. And I'm not to dismiss, but I think for those who don't necessarily express their emotions in the clearest way that still validates the other person's emotions, it's just a very much like just grab a seat. Well, welcome to the train. That's kind of what it feels like.
It's all a lot of that is welcome to our world. And I think there should be an acknowledgement from Asian Americans saying, yeah, it sucks. I feel you. Like just saying like it hasn't been
get the empathy, honestly.
Exactly.
It really would.
Which that's what it is. Like maybe as a female it might be different, but I don't have to worry about the same things that you have to worry about.
No.
I might worry about them now. I might be experiencing heightened shit from Asians now in a malicious and like attacking way, but I don't have to worry about the same things that a Black woman has to worry about. And I can acknowledge it and I'm comfortable with that. And I'm not saying that I like, why are we having a dick measuring contest
Yeah,
on who gets
exactly.
oppressed more? Why do you want to be more oppressed?
I think the reason
Like,
why the measuring contest comes up on the black side is because it's so it like from so usually the discussion is white people are oppressing us and then everyone else is just watching it happen. So it's like, oh, so it's our turn to watch. Like it's almost like a, you know what, I know it's wrong, but now you'll get to see what it looks like. Sucks, don't it? Like I'm not saying it's good, but it's that I feel like this has to be done because the passiveness was an injustice in many ways, and it's like a way of saying this is justice, and it's not
and
right.
the sad part about it is that the generalization is passiveness, because I would have never been passive in terms of like when I started recognizing that race affected me personally as an Asian, and it has from a young age, because when I was a kid, people would call me chink all the time, and I'm like, huh? I didn't realize it was a chink, like, because I'm barely Chinese. And so, like, if you don't get those experiences, if you don't feel how race affects you, you will probably not be as open to conversations about race if it hasn't affected you, even as a person of color. Because there are people who are Asian, who are passive, a lot of them, and there are people who are my age who haven't, because they're only in Asian circles, they haven't been able to see the effects of race in them. Additionally, we as an Asian community, this is not our value is not to speak out and speak up. Even in Asia, not even in America, to appease the white people. In Asia, you don't speak up. You just don't. It's just how it is. You're grown that way, and that carries over into America.
Makes sense.
So it's unfortunate, but it's has to be acknowledged. It has to be acknowledged, and I think the younger generations, first generation Asian Americans, they're not as passive, and I think that that's what's causing a good shift for the future. Is that the more this gets ingrained, the more that younger Asian Americans are like, no, we're not that. Let's not be that. Because we're growing up with our best friends who are black, our partners who are black, people in our schools who are black. We see it. We can't be passive anymore. And I'm seeing a lot of that, even in like middle-aged Asian Americans. So that part makes me happy, at least, or gives me hope, I should say.
Fair.
And now I shall flip the question and ask you the same thing.
What? What is the question that you are flipping?
Well, you're asking what's going to change in the generation of Asians not be passive in their support for the black community anymore. And I'm asking you, what's it going to take to get a shift in the black community to feel like, instead of saying you don't show up for this, you don't do this, you're just like them, you oppress us too, what will it take for them to acknowledge, for the black community to acknowledge that there is support from the Asian community, and that you can have solidarity with us as well?
I really think it's not even the young generation, because we don't feel the resentment for our existence from the young generation. We feel a curiosity and a lack of knowledge from the younger generation. It's the sentiment from the older generation where they display a conviction in their feelings towards us. Those are the ones where it's like you could have 10 people your age who are great, then you walk into a store and you just see how after they deal with a white person, how they look at you like trash. That's what ruins all progress. It's the older sentiment, which and for us as black people, we consume a lot of Asian media through our video games and our arts. We have a liking for it, but through that, like with white people, we study those who dislike us very, very much, because everybody does. So we need to navigate the spaces that contain people that dislike us consistently. So we learn them. And one thing that I have learned is that Asian culture is strong, which means even though you might be a child who interacts with me, my presumption is if you're coming from immigrant family, your parents don't want you around me, and we never tend to get the confirmation that we're wrong. So I feel like it'd be good to not have Asians talk to black people, have them talk to other Asians.
That's happening.
Yeah, because I think because when I go into a store, like how you said you can tell when people are like, it's your moment, and they're like, how are you?
Mm-hmm.
I've never felt that from an older Asian person in any moment in my life where they've humanized me.
Mind you, I've never felt that
or your
from
family.
Older people in general. I've never felt that from older black people that I see. In fact, most older black women don't acknowledge me. Not your family, obviously. But walking in the streets and then walking with you, I definitely get looks of like,
I could see how.
I definitely get that. Older black men is mostly a fetish.
Yes.
Mostly sexualized.
Yeah.
So, and the thing is, I don't think I've ever been mad at it. I don't think I've ever been like, oh, they're racist towards Asians. I don't think that's ever crossed my mind in terms of reasoning. I think the reasoning for me, when I try to explain how people from other cultures treat me, I try to take out race from it first, just as okay, let's try this. Let's just throw that first, and then I'll add in race and see how it feels. Because I like to think that perhaps sometimes it's less racially charged than I think it is. But one thing I would offer in terms of your perspective with older Asians is I also don't think there's enough education in either community about how older generation Asians, just how they operate in general. Not the anti-blackness necessarily, but how they treat their own children, how they treat people of other cultures, what it means to be an immigrant in America, why they act the way that they do, why do they have the certain perspectives that they do, because I don't think that there's enough understanding there. And I'm not saying that this is an excuse for how they treat the Black community. I'm saying that with an understanding of it all around, young Asians, first generation Asians with their immigrant grandparents or their parents being like, why won't they understand? Why can't they unlearn? Why won't they listen to me when I tell them about these things? Really understanding what it means to be an immigrant and coming to America at a time when immigrants were allowed to, what was the climate under which they were coming into? Like when immigrants were coming into North America, what was going on between blacks and whites? What's the context there? Where do you find your place? So if you come in here and the country looks like two things only, where do you find yourself? And I'm not saying this is an excuse for the anti-blackness. I'm just saying that if I'm going to understand everybody, I'm going to understand everybody. And I'm trying to understand context and everything that people, interact with. And for a lot of older Asian Americans, they experience or racism against Asians from blacks when they came to America, because at that point it was already a dick measuring contest of like, no, we've been slaves, we're fighting for civil rights, this is our shit, this, like, you're still an immigrant, you're still other. And I think that there's some of that still gets carried. Like the immigrants, they don't understand what North Americanism is. Like people are saying now, Black history is American history, and that is true. But to Asians coming in, they're not, like, if you don't speak the language, if you don't understand what America is, all you have are your values from your country. And so coming in to not understand where you fit in makes you feel like everybody is, just if you think about it, okay,
everybody's the outside.
Everybody is the outside. So you come in, okay, those people, they're getting fucked, so maybe we don't want to chill
Be
with
safe
them.
with them.
The
make
white
him
people,
happy.
yeah, exactly. That's what you do
Yeah.
when you come into a new group. You think about going to a new high school. You think about going into new friends. You're trying to survive, and so I empathize with that with older Asians. But that doesn't mean I condone. That does not mean I condone how they feel. And I'm happy to see that there are a lot of younger Asians educating their own parents.
Mm.
There are tons. I can't even, it's cool to see, but there are so many resources online in the respective Asian languages of how to talk to your parents about anti-blackness, which is really nice to see that younger Asians have put together. Like, okay, show them what it means, show them what anti-blackness is. They might not even know. Show them what's happening to the Black community. Tell them why we can't be like this. Let them know what white supremacy is. Like, if you're coming in as an immigrant and all you're taught to do is be the worker and survive, you don't have time. Like, and we're seeing a lot of it. Asians make up in North America a lot of the most impoverished people. And because Asia in general is very impoverished, they bring those same survival tactics to North America because the standard of living is so high here. There's so much poverty. And so I think that they are older Asian communities. They just don't think about that shit. They're just like, well, we came here. Why would we want to be treated like that? If we just have to be nice to those people, we can survive.
It's all logic. It's all logic.
The thing is, there's no emotion in it. And Asians are primarily cold.
For us, we can appreciate the logic to their approach and not hold it against them. Very clearly. It's those who...
By us, you mean you and me?
Yeah. I think Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing 27 years later still paints the same picture of America. The whites oppressing the blacks, and then the blacks seeing others come in and be put on top of them. Mm-hmm. And it's like, it's a structural mind fuck because everybody loses except for the whites.
But at the end of the day, that is the case. Yeah. And I think that's what I would hope, that people who feel that way and also feel and have experienced severe racism from Asians, especially older Asians and elderly Asians, especially when you see that black person who like pushed that Thai dude in San Francisco, when you see like clashes of the races. Yeah, that was a tough one. That was, I showed it to you. I showed you a picture of this guy like pushing this Asian dude into like a garage.
I thought that was a white guy.
No, it was a black dude. Oh. So stuff like that perpetuates the divisiveness, which I completely understand. But what I think is the commonality is, again, the white people put us there. Why do older Asian generation of immigrants, why did they think that? Is because they came in and they saw white supremacy already.
They saw the structure of the hierarchy of the new culture that they're in. Like, okay, so we can't ever go past him because he'll knock us down, but we got to stay above them. Mm-hmm. It literally is like, you got to fit in. And I think immigrants come in.
Don't bother anybody.
Like even African immigrants, they come in like, okay, so we can't be like those blacks. Mm-hmm. We got to be like these whites. Mm-hmm. Cool. Mm-hmm. It's the same. I think the thing with America is, I think everybody who comes in to North America should have to have a cultural enlightening in terms of the initial cultural discussion, which is the foundation of all cultural discussions in this Western world, which is indigenous, black, and white. Mm-hmm. That is a discussion that is a discussion on its own, and before anybody can add to it, I think there has to be an understanding of it, which
I agree.
which would solve a lot of the issues of misunderstanding amongst other groups.
Well, again, it all comes back to white supremacy. Why don't they teach us cultural history? Yeah. To oppress us? Why do they only teach us certain areas? Why do they paint the picture of indigenous people as like
savages?
As looking like XYZ.
To maintain the separation. Because there'll be no desire to humanize the other side when they're taught to through a lens.
But also back in the day, not saying that it's like this now, but on a large scale in corporate America, it definitely is, like in Wall Street and where billionaires are concerned, is imagine putting them together. We'd be fucked. Yeah. If all the BIPOCs united, they'd be fucked.
The intention of segregation was
fear.
That is the exact situation in essence. Now let's keep the whites away from the blacks because the blacks will take us over. It's the same thing being applied, just on a different scale and a different set of shades. Now we have the blacks who are starting to understand the whites and like to be with the whites. Let's make sure that, and then we have the Asians who like the whites, but they don't like, all right, let's keep it like this. And then they'll take over the fight and we'll just step out like the royals.
Mm.
Literally.
Mm-hmm.
We'll step out of the discussion while you guys prop us up.
Yeah. And that's why I really do agree that, like, especially in Canada, I would hope for all of Canada and the US especially, that in education, especially for immigrants coming in, like when you take your test to become a citizen, that this knowledge is part of your becoming a citizen. And that this knowledge is part of the education system. Because if we're calling ourselves a cultural mosaic, well, then let's not just learn one of those things. Let's learn how culture, Canadian culture, is actually made up of multiple ethnicities. And here are those respective ethnicities' history within Canada.
I was going to say, to add to that, there should be, I think, to give more of a Canadian context to the discussion also, any immigrant coming to Canada should be educated on Quebec's history and place in the Confederation. No, it's same.
No, I agree, but it's funny because you always bring up Quebec.
Well, no, if we're talking about learning where you're going, I think Canada gets a lot of our issues come from people not understanding the history of the country's formation also.
I do think, and we've said this before, like there's always, Canada, it's different in Canada. No, it's the same.
It's just different issues.
Different issues, but I do think that we have an advantage that the fact that everybody learns the cultural mosaic in history, that's already in our history classes, that we can further build that out to be very inclusive.
Beautiful tapestry.
We have so much opportunity in education and in the education system to educate our kids about diversity. It's not just Canadian history, it's diversity. What does diversity mean? That actually means a diverse history. Yeah. That actually means, let's learn about immigration. Let's not learn how the white government created immigration.
Let's go to those communities and ask their stories about how it happened.
Exactly.
And how it felt.
Let's actually understand how immigrants felt landing in Canada. What was the context? All of that stuff. We're a smart enough generation now that we can build those things to ourselves. But if we ingrain them in education, then future generations will just only get smarter. That's the whole point.
They have a better default starting point to build upon as a society because you all have a greater understanding as a base.
Exactly.
It makes it easier to move as a unified people.
And I think that in addition to facts and statistics and history within history, we also need to teach empathy. Because if you don't understand what that is, if you don't understand how you can identify and feel connected to issues within other people's lives, whether that's race or not, there's no way that you can shift mindset or have understanding conversations or have respect for another person if you're unwilling to feel as they feel from their shoes. And so if you teach history, there needs to be like, okay, so in 18, blah, 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 this 19, this, and this is how it felt for those communities. And here's evidence of that.
Recounts.
Exactly. Because if you don't know how the climate right now makes me feel, you can't be supportive for me. There's no way you could be an active ally if you don't understand how I feel. Doesn't mean you have to feel the exact same way, but you do need to have an understanding of it. If I don't ask you what it's like to be Black, how am I supposed to find a connection if I don't even know? And so I do think that there's two sides of historical context. Is what exactly happened, data. What is the data? What is the research? Impact and insight. What does that mean for communities? How has that affected where they're at now? What is the mindset now? If you want a more tolerant society, you need to build in tools and skills in education around how to be tolerant. And I don't think that that's what our education system does. Our education system doesn't teach us how to be tolerant of other people. It
reinforces white history.
It reinforces supremacy.
Yeah.
White supremacy and also your own racial supremacy of like as immigrants, we're better than Black people at least.
Yeah. We
don't want to teach that.
That's a good selling point for America. If you come here, we'll make sure that you're better than the Blacks at least. Because in America, that's still great. Yeah. It's still better than 9% of the world to be just a little better than Blacks.
That's what they've been doing.
Yeah,
that's what the white people been doing. The white people have been
We'll give you loans. You can open stores in their community.
This is where the model minority myth comes from. Yeah. It is in fact a myth because while many people of other colors might think that Asians assumed this position on their fucking own, That's a myth.
It's built off of money from the poor communities that the whites want to go into, but they said, hey, we'll give you Asians a few loans if you go here and slave for a few dollars, but you know what? You'll get your kids into college eventually. You'll get out of here. They won't. They'll still be here.
The model minority myth is another form of white supremacy, is another form of oppression on the Asian community. It might not look that way because we get loans and we get land and all this, and this is not something that Black people or Indigenous people have been able to have. They've been actively denied. Although there's lots of statistics now showing how the Chinese community, like in the Bay Area and San Francisco and other areas, they were actively oppressed by the government. People burned down Chinatowns. People put up barbed wire around Chinatowns and Asian neighborhoods and burned down predominantly Asian neighborhoods. So yes, if you didn't know, now you do. There is that type of extreme discriminatory acts as well as lynchings for Asian people. They did exist. Again, not to the degree, and I'm not saying like, oh, I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, we experienced it too. That's not the tone I'm going for. I'm just saying, if that's the case, if that is our history, then there does need to be some empathy for the Black community within the Asian community. There does need to be this acknowledgement that, okay, this is how it feels. This is an ounce of how it feels. This is, when we step outside of our communities, we are the same as Black people. We are still oppressed by white supremacy. And that if we want to have true solidarity, we do need to step outside of our communities. We do need to see that the commonality is that white supremacy has been oppressing people of color, BIPOCs, for years and years and years.
This moment reminds me of 9/11, where as a Black person, like, oh, the white people don't hate us right now. They hate them. Ooh, this is what it looks like. Ooh, interesting. So y'all don't hate us right now? Nah, let's go hate them. Oh yeah.
And let me be serious. Let me note that this is North American, because in other countries, I don't know the history, and within Asia and within other parts of the world, people have experienced discrimination very similar to Black communities that is in that area of the world.
Yeah.
But in North America, I can't comfortably say that.
Storyline.
Yeah, exactly. I can't comfortably sit here and say Asians have it just as bad as. I can't say that. Not at all. We were not enslaved in the same way as Black people were. Yes, we came over as labor workers to build the Transcontinental Highway and the CPN and all that shit, but that's not the same. That is not the same. And I, as a somewhat of a woke Asian, can acknowledge that it's not the same. And I do not want to measure oppression. I only want to support the Black community. I only want to support the Indigenous community. And I'm not going to do that by posting all over social media that we should do X, Y, and Z. I'm going to do that actively.
Indeed.
Actively.
You will
in my everyday life
in making many, many Black people rich through your assistance of my existence.
Not just you.
What?
I try to do it with other people too.
I'm just saying.
But at least other Black people pay me.
Don't worry about them things. The money coming soon.
Just saying.
Money coming soon.
But all in all, I think that these conversations are good. I think more people of different colors should have them. Conversations like this between different people of color should continue to happen because there's commonality between us. We are stronger together. All of our experiences are valid. And I don't think there's any way I could, like, as a person, so much of who I am as a Canadian is due to other cultures. I'm inspired by lots of other cultures. And I also love being Asian.
And on that note, we judo chop.
That wasn't uncomfortable, though.
Never is.